There is a word that needs no translation in any language on earth, a word that conjures instantly, a world of shadows, of whispered orders, of loyalty bought in blood and silence enforced by fear. A word that has attached itself to governments, to Wall Street boardrooms, to Hollywood screens, to the highest levels of political power in multiple countries simultaneously. That word is mafia. But here is what almost nobody tells you. The mafia did not begin in a dark basement with men swearing oaths over candles and pistols. It did not begin with Al Capone in Chicago or Lucky Luciano in New York. It did not begin in a Hollywood screenwriter's imagination. It began in the sun-scorched hills of western Sicily, in the desperate poverty of a broken island, in the collapse of feudal order and the vacuum of power that followed. It began not as crime but as survival, not as an organization but as a culture of distrust toward authority, of loyalty to family above all else, of silence as the only reliable shield against a world that had never once protected ordinary people from the powerful. Understanding the mafia means understanding Sicily. And understanding Sicily means going back, much further back than most people realize. To understand why the mafia was born in Sicily and nowhere else, you need to understand what Sicily had endured for over 2,000 years before the word mafia ever existed. Sicily is the largest island in the Mediterranean. It sits at the crossroads of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, which made it, throughout history, one of the most invaded, occupied, colonized, and exploited pieces of land on the planet. The Greeks came, then the Romans, then the Arabs, who actually ruled Sicily remarkably well for 2 centuries, introducing sophisticated agriculture and a culture of learning. Then the Normans, then the Spanish, who ruled Sicily for over 400 years and left it in a state of feudal paralysis that would define the island's social structure well into the 19th century. Under Spanish rule, Sicily developed a landed aristocracy of staggering wealth and privilege, and beneath them, a peasant class of almost unimaginable poverty with no legal protection, no political representation, and no reason whatsoever to trust any authority that called itself a government, because every government Sicily had ever known had arrived from outside, ruled for its own benefit, and departed, leaving the island poorer than before. In this environment, where the state was the enemy, where justice was a luxury only the powerful could afford, where survival depended entirely on who you knew and who would protect you, a different kind of order began to emerge. An order built not on law, but on relationships, on respect, on fear, on omerta, the code of silence that would become the mafia's most powerful weapon. The mafia, as a recognizable organization, began to take shape in western Sicily in the first half of the 19th century, specifically in the area around Palermo and the fertile agricultural region known as the Conca d'Oro, the Golden Shelf. The context was a Sicily in transition. The feudal system was being formally abolished. The Bourbon kings of Naples, who ruled Sicily as part of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, were losing their grip. And in 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi and his famous 1,000 soldiers swept through Sicily as part of the campaign to unify Italy, promising liberation and a new order. What actually arrived was something quite different. Italian unification brought a new government from the distant north that understood Sicily even less than the Spanish had. It brought new taxes, new military conscription, and new laws that disrupted whatever local arrangements had allowed rural communities to function. Into the chaos stepped a class of men who had already been operating as informal power brokers in western Sicily, men who controlled access to water and land, who resolved disputes, who provided protection, and who demanded loyalty and payment in return. These men were called by various names: uomini d'onore, men of honor. The term mafia itself appears in Sicilian dialect with roots possibly in Arabic, meaning boldness, bravado, or the ability to project power through personality alone. By the 1860s, it had become the common term for this emerging shadow government, a state within a state, a power beneath the power, and it was only just getting started. What made the Sicilian Mafia, the Cosa Nostra, meaning our thing, uniquely powerful and uniquely durable was not its violence. Violence was common in 19th century Sicily. What made it extraordinary was its culture, a set of values, rituals, and codes so deeply internalized that they created not merely an organization but an entire alternative society with its own rules, its own justice system, its own economy, and its own moral framework. At the center of everything was omerta, the absolute code of silence. A mafioso did not speak to authorities, ever, under any circumstances, regardless of what had been done to them or their family. To break omerta was the deepest possible betrayal, punishable by death, and the dishonor fell not just on the individual but on their entire family. Alongside omerta was the principle of respect, rispetto, which governed every interaction within and outside the organization. Then came loyalty, feudality, to your family, to your boss, to your clan above all other allegiances, including the state, the church, and sometimes even blood relatives outside the organization. And the initiation ritual that bound men to these codes was elaborate and deliberate. A finger pricked, blood on a sacred image, often a saint. The image burned in the cupped hands while an oath was recited. You entered the mafia the way you entered the church, through fire, through blood, and through a promise that death alone could release you from. The mafia might have remained a Sicilian phenomenon, a local shadow government serving a local population, if not for one of the greatest mass migrations in human history. Between 1880 and 1924, approximately 4 million Italians emigrated to the United States, driven by poverty, drought, and the grinding disappointment of Italian unification, which had delivered very little to southern Italy and Sicily. They arrived in New York, in New Orleans, in Chicago, in Boston, carrying their languages, their foods, their saints, and their social structures. And some of them carried something else: the culture of the mafia. The first documented mafia activity in America appears in New Orleans in the 1880s, a shadow network operating within the Sicilian immigrant community, controlling the docks and the produce markets with the same combination of protection, intimidation, and community service that had worked so effectively in Palermo. In 1890, New Orleans Police Chief David Hennessy was assassinated after threatening to expose mafia operations. 19 Sicilian men were arrested. When the jury acquitted them, some said through bribery and intimidation, a mob stormed the jail and lynched 11 of the men. It was a moment that revealed everything about how America would relate to its mafia problem for the next century. It was a problem real enough to kill a police chief, and complicated enough to make justice almost impossible to deliver. The American Mafia existed before Prohibition, but Prohibition made it immortal. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution came into force, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol illegal across the entire country. It was the single greatest gift any government has ever accidentally given to organized crime. Almost overnight, a product that tens of millions of Americans wanted and were used to consuming became illegal, creating a black market of almost incomprehensible scale and value. And the Mafia, with its existing networks, its culture of operating outside the law, its system of corruption, and its capacity for organized violence, was perfectly positioned to supply it. The names from this era have become mythology. Al Capone in Chicago, who at his peak was earning the equivalent of over $1 billion a year in today's money from bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. Lucky Luciano in New York, the brilliant organizational mind who would transform the American Mafia from a collection of warring Sicilian gangs into a nationally coordinated criminal enterprise. Meyer Lansky, the financial genius who laundered mafia money through Swiss bank accounts and Caribbean casinos decades before the term money laundering even existed. These men did not just build criminal organizations. They built corporations with territories, budgets, management structures, and strategic planning. The Prohibition-era mafia was, in a dark and twisted sense, one of the most successful business enterprises in American history. By the early 1930s, the American Mafia had a problem. Success had made it chaotic. The Castellammer's War of 1930 to 1931, a bloody conflict between two factions of New York's Sicilian underworld, left dozens dead and threatened to destroy from within what Prohibition had built. Lucky Luciano's solution was as elegant as it was ruthless. He had his own boss Salvatore Maranzano assassinated and then convened a meeting that would reshape American organized crime permanently. From this meeting emerged the Commission, a governing body representing the 5 New York Mafia families, along with bosses from Chicago, Buffalo, and other major cities. The Commission was not a Hollywood invention. It was a real institution, part board of directors, part Supreme Court, that resolved disputes, approved major operations, and maintained the order that prevented the kind of open warfare that attracted unwanted government attention. The 5 New York families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, became the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. Their reach extended into labor unions, construction, garbage collection, the garment industry, the waterfront, and eventually into politics at the city, state, and in some documented cases, federal level. The Mafia was no longer just crime. It was infrastructure. It was woven into the fabric of American economic and political life so deeply that removing it would require not just law enforcement, but something approaching surgery on the body of the nation itself. The beginning of the end for the classic American Mafia came from 2 directions simultaneously. The first was a legal weapon forged specifically to fight it. The RICO Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, gave federal prosecutors a tool that finally matched the scale of what they were fighting. For the first time, being a member of a criminal organization was itself a crime. You did not have to be caught committing a specific act. Prosecutors could now target the entire structure. The second weapon was even more devastating than any law. It was omertà breaking down. Beginning in the 1980s, a series of high-profile mafia members began cooperating with federal authorities. Most dramatically, underboss of the Gambino family Sammy the Bull Gravano testified against his own boss John Gotti, the self-styled Teflon Don, and sent him to prison for life. The code of silence that had protected the mafia for over a century was cracking. The 1986 Mafia Commission trial prosecuted the bosses of all 5 New York families simultaneously using RICO. It was a stunning achievement of law enforcement, and yet the story does not end there. Because the Mafia, the original Sicilian Cosa Nostra, never disappeared. It adapted. It moved deeper into legitimate business. It went quieter, and organized crime in general simply evolved. The Italian-American Mafia giving way to or sharing space with Russian, Albanian, Mexican, and Chinese criminal organizations who had studied the original model carefully and learned its most important lesson. Power built on silence, loyalty, and fear does not need a name to survive. And there it is. From the sun-scorched hills of western Sicily to the courtrooms of New York. From desperate peasants with no one to protect them to billion-dollar criminal empires woven into the fabric of nations. The Mafia was never just crime. It was a response to a world that failed ordinary people so completely that they built their own world underneath it. Whether that response became something monstrous, and it does not erase where it came from, or why. That is what history demands we understand. Not just what happened, but why it had to. If this story gripped you, please hit that like button and subscribe. It keeps these stories coming every week. And now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what history subject are you most curious about? A forgotten empire, a legendary figure, a crime that changed the world? Write it down, because our next video might be your idea brought to life. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story. Until then, stay curious. And remember, history's darkest chapters always have the most to teach us.